Serious, Redditors who have killed another person for any reason, how did it feel and how do you cope with it? I'm a IQ nurse. On average once a month I switch off someone's ventilator and life support systems meds. I always cry. I just do my best to try and support the family, but it takes a little of my soul every time. A distant relative listed me as their healthcare proxy and had a living will that indicated that they did not wish to be kept alive by medical intervention when there was no hope of a meaningful recovery. This relative's attending doctors and a hospital committee agreed that a meaningful recovery was not possible. I had life support discontinued. He died about a day later. I know that my relative chose me as his healthcare proxy over a closer family member because he knew that I would honor his wishes. Even if it's emotionally difficult for me, even if his wife and children would never speak to me again, which they have not, I cope by focusing on the idea that I helped him to die on his own terms. I made sure that he didn't suffer unnecessarily in the last few days or weeks that he might have had left. My dad was a long-term alcoholic with brain damage from the alcoholism and a related accident. He committed suicide slowly, locked himself up in a motel room and drank himself to death. I knew what he was doing because he told me. I asked him if he wanted me to call emergency services and he said no, they might try to save me. I never made that call. A few days later I got the call saying housekeeping found him in the motel room surrounded by empty vodka bottles. I do feel guilty for not intervening, but I know it's what he wanted. There was no hope of recovery and he was in his final stages of alcoholism. I loved him very, very much. Too much to watch him suffer anymore. Thank you for sharing. I'm sorry. I killed a rimhead who broke into my grandfather's house when I was 14. It fricked with me for a long time, and still does occasionally. I carry a gun every day where I'm allowed to and I'm fairly paranoid about noises in my house at night. For the coping part, I just had to keep telling myself I was justified, and if I hadn't, then he would have probably hurt me if not killed me. The image itself is pretty much burned into my mind forever. But again, it comes down to telling myself that I had to. I felt the side of his skull collapse and massive sigh of relief. Guy tried to mug me, pulled me into an alley and kicked me to the ground. I landed on some piping and swung it blindly as hard as I could. Guy dropped to the ground and the right half of his face was caved in. The police came and let me go. I guess the guy was a repeat offender because one of the officers recognized him, took my report and let me go home. I don't really talk about it unless it gets brought up. I'm not some big dude or anything. I'm like 5 feet 6 inches with a dad body. I just got really lucky. Edit wow, most upvotes I've ever seen. I'm no Agent 47 or Terminator. I'm just a guy that's seen enough that one dead guy doesn't bother me too much. I don't really want to go into my whole life story right now. If you feel like going in depth, you can probably glean bits and pieces from my past comments. You'll see I'm just your average nobody. Also, I like guinea pigs. To this day, I blame myself for my grandmother's death. It happened when I was 6 years old. Me and my family would visit my gran almost every day. She used to be a baker, and even when retired, she enjoyed doing it in her spare time. So I used to always come over and eat cake and drink tea with her. Fast forward to 6-year-old me, playing and running around the house. I bump into my gran and she falls badly on her knee. She goes into hospital. 2 weeks later, she's dead. I know, deep down, it had to be something else that she died from. But I can't shake it. I feel this enormous guilt. It makes me feel depressed and suicidal. She was the woman I loved most in my life until that point. And I feel like I killed her. That crap hurts your soul. OP, I'm so sorry for your loss. That must have been a hard thing to go through. I can imagine, as I was really close with my grandmother too, and her death broke my heart. Please don't blame yourself. It's not your fault and there's nothing you could have done. I'm sure she was very lucky to have you. I don't know if this really for what you're looking for, but I had to make the call on pulling the plug on my father. He had 2 strokes within a week. His heart was working at 20%, and they said he wouldn't recover, and this was the best thing for him. What it looked like from my side, it's they drugged him up and starved him to death. It hurt, and I guess I buried it because I didn't think about it until now. But I feel like I'm the one that gave up on him and killed him. Try not to look at it that way. The medical professionals caring for him felt that there was no chance he would recover and advised you accordingly. Medicine is not perfect, and there are times when the process of dying can't be changed or stopped. I know it was hard, and I'm sorry it's causing you pain. I was 17 or 18 at the time. I was going to school at my local community college to get my high school diploma. I didn't do well at my high school, so this was a good alternative. Drugs and alcohol and friends got in the way at my high school. I was always looking for ways to get high or drunk. I had a pretty good supply of prescription medications I was able to get my hands on as well. At the time, Oxy was hitting the scene pretty heavily in my neighborhood and with all my friends. Before too long I became interested. So with a way to get the money for the $70 pill, I got a bunch of the meds and sold them an adult acquaintance. I went through with buying the Oxy, and so began my downward spiral of addiction. That's a story of its own. I went and got high with friends and went on as normal. Sometime in the following days I was at school and I got a call from an old GF at my old high school saying that the person I had sold the meds to had died, and there were texts from me in his phone. She had told me that word was going around that I was going to go to jail for manslaughter. I was instantly in shock. The shittiest thing is that I had a presentation that would determine if I could continue in the program to get my diploma. I could hardly gather myself to finish the day. I barely made it through, but I was able to get it done. After I got home, I spent the next month or two avoiding everyone. Everyone I heard a car drive by my house, my heart would drop and I knew I was going to jail or prison. No one ever came. I was never contacted by anyone to this day. I slowly started to leave my house again and see my friends. A friend from my high school was best friends with the guy. I avoided him at all cost. Until one day it was unavoidable. We came up and we started talking about the situation. I couldn't even look at him. After all of my worry, he told me he held no hard feelings towards me. He told me that this guy was an adult who decided to get high on these meds and drink extensively, then got behind the wheel. I still don't know all the details, but that whole ordeal screwed me up for a long time. I continued to use drugs for a long time. Like I said, that's a story of its own. I now have 5+ years clean and live a great family life with my GF and child. Congratulations on getting and staying clean. I drove over a man's head with a car. It was at night, on busy road. I could not use high beam. He was already laying in the middle of the road. I had no chance of avoiding him. He was drunk. He died in the hospital, or on a way there. I felt bad for a time. But I was probably not the first one to drive over him. Someone probably did hit and run on him before me. So, this was not my fault. After a short time I felt better. My sister had an eating disorder, and I was ignorant about it. I just figured she wasn't eating as much, but that wasn't a problem, right? I didn't realize how long she hadn't been eating properly though. We lived together alone and I didn't notice. One day I got a call from one of her colleagues saying she'd collapsed at work. I immediately went into denial. There's no way this could be that bad. She's just exhausted. A few days of rest and food and she'll be okay. She died a few hours later in emergency. I just kind of shut down for a few days. It was like I couldn't process anything. I don't think I still 100% believe it. This was a little under a year ago. I can't ever say with a straight face that it's not my fault. I'm still just kind of going through each day, because there isn't much I can care about anymore. Don't be too hard on yourself. Hard to know what's a severe symptom and what's not if you're outside the medical world, and what it means. Plus, there isn't a ton of awareness about eating disorders. Everyone knows it can happen, but few would be able to correctly spot the warning signs. I feel like I killed an elderly lady at the nursing home I used to cook at. Since it was an end-of-life elderly care facility, if a resident requested something from the kitchen that we had on hand or could make, we had to do it regardless of dietary restrictions. This particular lady was deathly allergic to eggs but asked for poached eggs that morning to go with her toast and bacon. Another strange request because she usually had oatmeal and fresh fruit. We didn't have an allergy restrictions list available to us in the kitchen until the head of the department came in around 10 or so in the morning. Well, I cooked them for her and delivered them to her, as she was usually one of the first ones to ask for breakfast on her unit, and poached eggs tend to be very nasty if not eaten when hot. About half an hour later, I was taking the lunch menus out to the residents on the halls that couldn't come to the dining room. The people from the funeral home passed by me in the hall and went straight into her room. I took the rest of the week off, and even though not only my co-workers and her family reassured me that it wasn't my fault, I still feel like it is. I've struggled a lot with trying to cope with it and not blame myself. I've actually gave up professional cooking because of it and refused to even volunteer in a nursing home or soup kitchen because of it. I am in therapy trying to work through my feelings, but it's going nowhere really. A couple of years ago, I was working as a night shift CNA, certified nursing assistant, in a rehabilitation facility, one that was for medical patients, not for people with addiction. I had an older patient who had come in after a surgery. I don't remember what it was now. I went in to check his vitals and noticed that they were erratic. I rechecked his blood pressure and pulse many times and even got a different machine, but every time it was different. I had a bad feeling, so I had the nurse send him to the ER. He was taken away by ambulance and I finished my shift and left. I come back the next shift and he was back. The ER just sent him back a couple hours into the morning shift. I got to take his vitals and I check them every 2 hours. His vitals were erratic still and seemed to be declining. I made the nurse send him back to the ER. On my next shift, I was told that the ER had sent him back a couple hours into the morning shift and he died a couple hours later. He had a pulmonary embolism. I know it wasn't my fault, but I still feel upset and guilty that I hadn't done more. I should have had the nurse talk to the doctor at the ER or talk to the EMTs or something. I know there wasn't much I could do, being the bottom rung of the ladder, but I still think about him sometimes. He was such a kind man when he was lucid. I believe along the lines of, if you always talk about the person who died, you're keeping their memory alive and spirit close to you, so here it is. My sister-in-law ran over and killed her oldest son. It hasn't even been a year yet. He was only 8. He didn't die instantly but succumbed to his injuries in the hospital shortly after arriving. She said she meant to step on the brakes but hit the gas instead. The car slammed him into a brick wall. The next day and the weeks following, she was acting normal and smiling. Certain things she said, I just couldn't believe how she was being. It may have been shock, I don't know. As time has passed, she now seems more devastated. I really can't judge how she or anyone should act in that situation, cause everyone processes death and trauma differently. I've never been to a sadder funeral than my little nephew's. Rip Curly Q. Dang, that must be an unbearable amount of pain to kill your own child accidentally. Sometimes the brain just chooses to ignore it emotionally in order to survive. My condolences to both you and her. I'm a cop and I responded to an active shooter and I was shot in gunfight. He shot me with an AR-15. Our vests do not stop these rounds, and I shot and killed him with mine. I was shot in a very vital area and almost died. As for killing him, I felt guilty for quite a while. I'll explain. As a cop and a gun guy, I knew how bad my injuries were. I knew I was in serious trouble and my odds were not good. I was laid out on the ground in a massive amount of pain. So much pain I couldn't speak. The whole situation was extremely chaotic and violent. It was absolutely terrifying, because I knew I was dying. When rescue picked me up, my blood pressure was 60/30. I felt guilty because I know the guy I shot went through the same terrifying experience. My friends watched him die and told me how it went down. I know I was 100% justified, because he was about to kill innocent people, and he shot me. But I know what it is like to be laying on the ground dying from a gunshot wound, and it's horrifying. I don't feel guilty anymore, but I did for a little while after. It has been a long time since it has happened, so I'm okay with everything. I made the correct and best decision that could have been made at the time, and no innocent people were hurt. I don't have full-on PTSD, but I'm not the same as I was before. I also have chronic medical issues and have been in and out of the hospital, even after returning to work. As of now, I don't feel anything when I think about having killed someone. I will probably have to do it again, and I won't hesitate. Glad that you're an officer. When I was 5, I caused the death of my 10-month-old cousin. I never talked to anyone about this. It was half accident and half not. I didn't think she would actually die, but in the back of my mind I knew she might. My mother, my aunt, her mother, me, and my cousin were all out in the garden, with a little pool set up. The pool was really shallow, like, shallow enough that she could sit in it with the water only up to her chest. My mother and aunt got up and went inside to go use drugs. I knew what they were doing and got really annoyed with it, because they would always promise fun things and then go do that. My cousin fell over in the water. I got out and called for my mother, but they didn't hear me. I just felt annoyed because they were always off getting high, and I didn't do anything. I walked away and started playing somewhere else. They didn't come back for probably 15 or 20 minutes. I'm so sorry, Ellie. I'm so sorry. I thought they would come back in a minute and it would make them feel bad for going away like that. I'll never forget it. She just fell over in the water and laid there under it. She didn't struggle or try to get up or do anything. She just lay there still under the water. No one ever blamed me. I was 5. But I was precocious and I remember thinking that they'd come back and feel bad for leaving her alone and going to get high. I remember my thinking at the time and the active choice I made to walk away. It was not your fault. It is the sole responsibility of the parent to be next to the child playing in water at all times. If not, I am actually furious at them putting you in that situation, scarring you for life. This guy did a joint venture with him. The client decided not to pay us, and he called me asking me for the money of the project, and I told him I was doing my best to collect it but that it would be difficult and told him not to get his hopes up. Later that day while in a party I was with his brother and he got a call from the police telling him that his brother had shot himself because of money troubles. I felt horrible for months. His widow kept calling me for months asking me for money, and she didn't understand that the client decided not to pay us. She eventually stopped calling and I never got the money from the project. Frick, that sucks. A guy was traveling towards me on his motorcycle. I had just pulled out onto the road he was on and was getting up to speed. I saw his handlebars start to get out of control, then all at once he was thrown from his bike towards my truck. His head struck my front left tire. The most noticeable sound of death I've ever heard. I knew it immediately. I got out and a very dark red blood was coming from his nose. He was unconscious and dead. I said a prayer for him. The thing is when I saw his handlebars start to get squirrely I kind of veered to the right out of instinct, then it happened so fast but I had some guilt thinking that veer caused him to directly hit my tire. The officer explained to me that I hadn't veered, he made a cake through the windshield killing us both. Anyways, for several months I had a hard time driving. When anything was in the opposite coming towards me I flinched. When motorcycles were coming I'd dang near pull over. Anyways, the PTSD was real. It sucked. Poor guy lost his life because he was riding on bad tires. His front tire blew out and that's what caused the handlebars to lock up on him. I inspected his tires at the scene and they were bald and very worn. I got a little pee off for a minute thinking I could have had my kids in the truck and he could have come through the window or they could have witnessed what thankfully only I had to. I got over the anger real fast when his wife showed up. I just wish he'd paid more attention to his tires. Bad deal. Sucked real bad. I eventually got over the fear of oncoming bikes and vehicles, but I will never forget that sound. When I was in my early teens I moved to the south to be with my boyfriend, now ex, and we lived in this old dirty camper with 2 other people. For the most part, everyone in the area was on drugs and poor. A good friend of ours had an addiction to opiates, especially fentanyl. My ex's mother had just passed from cancer. She had several different cancers, including bone, and was on a lot of strong painkillers before she passed. One night, my ex and his friends all played a show at a local venue. The show was cancelled a week earlier due to rain. So, this time we were driven to the show in my ex's father's van, containing a large amount of fentanyl in the back. Our friend begged the father for one. He had taken them many times before. He knew how to open them up and boot it. He also had a terrible wisdom tooth that constantly caused him pain. The father agreed to give him just one. Due to the tooth pain, our friend decided to chew the patch over the next several hours. I believe this was a 72-hour pain patch. After the show, our friend couldn't talk. Rapidly he lost control over his body and became unconscious. I remember rubbing his back, the sweat drenched in his cardigan, trying to talk to him, only hearing whimpers and gurgles coming out. I started to panic. Naturally, I begged that we take him to the hospital. Everyone said that he does this every time he's high. It's fine. My intuition knew this wasn't okay. I remember the father looking at me and stating if anything happens to him, I'll never forgive myself. They couldn't carry him, so they put him in a wheelbarrow and took him down to our camper. They placed him in our bed. I took off his shoes and covered him in my blanket. I asked the friend that lived with us to please keep an eye on him through the night, as we were staying with my ex's family temporarily after his mother passed. His response was, I'm going to put my balls in his mouth and take a picture, jokingly. And I said, if he dies, you'll feel like crap. The next morning I received the call that he passed away in the night, and I dropped to my knees, screaming. After that, I had to find my ex, who was his best friend, and tell him what happened. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. The first few years were filled with guilt, regret, and what ifs. I wished I would have just called 911 myself. I wished I would have ignored what everyone was saying. That feeling in my gut I now trust every time I feel it. As time passed, I grew to accept it. That although I could have done something, there's nothing I could do now. I take it as a depressing, unfortunate life lesson in trusting my intuition. War. Not ecstatic about it but not ashamed in the least bit. Saw a kid torn apart by a roadside bomb. That one haunts me. I killed my own father with a gun. I was 13 years old. We lived in a large house with multiple rooms and security system. One night we had a confirmed break and I had guns in my room and security system is going off. My father is usually working at night, so being the man in the house I grabbed my gun and went searching. My father never went to work that night but there was an actual intruder. I was sitting under my cooking table and saw a man completely covered in black. So I shot at him 4 times, twice in the stomach, one in the shoulder and another in the leg. But the thing is, that wasn't the intruder because a scream. That's a scream with a voice I loved all too much. Then around the corner came the intruder sprinting and jumping out my kitchen window. I had no reaction because it filled my head instantly what I have done. I ran to the phone and called the police and he died on the way to the hospital. I wasn't charged being so young in a situation like that. My mother was heartbroken. I'm 19 on my own and have no contact with my family since that night. I'm a complete drug addict with no future. I blame myself for being irresponsible with a weapon. I know my father looking down on me knows I never meant for it to happen. IDK, what else to say? I'll just leave it at I love you dad and I'm so very sorry. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.